Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about evolution. The first thing I'm going to say is there is this idea that goes around that evolution is just a theory, but this is based on a misunderstanding of what theory means to scientists. Scientific theories are actually explanations that are based on lines of evidence, enable valid predictions, and have been tested in many ways. It is actually required that there be quite a lot of evidence to support something for it to be called a theory. Before that, it's a hypothesis, right? So, for example, there are actually two definitions of theory. This happens a lot. There are a bunch of different words that mean the opposite of each other almost, like inflammable. But in this case, it's theory. And the first definition is basically a guess. And this is what we mean when we talk about a theory. We say, I have a theory about whatever it is. It means that I don't really have evidence to support it. But that's exactly the opposite of what it is in science. In science, it's a well substantiated explanation for some aspect of the natural world. So, evolution is a theory, gravity is a theory, the germ theory of disease is a theory, etc. The father of evolution, of course, is Charles Darwin. When he was very young, he went on many cruises on the HMS Beagle. This is a picture of the Beagle, some pictures that are taken from the Galapagos Islands, which is that small group of islands on the west coast of South America that you see in that map. And that is where a lot of the observations that Charles Darwin did to support his theory of evolution occurred. And what he found was that the Galapagos Islands were a great place to do this because they were very isolated. There wasn't any way for terrestrial animals to move from other places to the Galapagos. Everything that happened, every animal that changed on that island was due to environmental pressures just of that little microcosm. What's also interesting is that while we all think of Charles Darwin as being the father of evolution, there was another person who had the exact same ideas at the same time, and that was Wallace. And Darwin had actually been collecting his data for quite a long time. He was compiling it all. He was ready to write a book, but he was concerned about it because he rightly assumed it would be controversial. And then he found out from a friend that Wallace was planning to present pretty much the same ideas to the Royal Society of Science. I believe that's what it was called. Doesn't matter. Royal Society. And so Charles Darwin wrote to Wallace and said, hey, I know you have this idea, but I had this idea too. Here's all of my evidence for it. And Wallace said, oh, you should give the talk, which was very nice of him. But Darwin actually said, never mind, I don't want to give the talk by myself. We both had the ideas. We should both present. So why is Darwin the only one really discussed? Well, the main reason is he had all the evidence. He had stacks and stacks and piles of evidence. Wallace had the idea, but Darwin had all of the evidence to back it up. So the core concepts of natural selection, let me back up and say, remember that I mentioned that even then, Darwin thought that the theory of evolution was going to be controversial. But if you actually look at any of the core concepts individually, they're not controversial at all. So, for example, core concept is observation number 1. Individuals in a population vary. That simply means that different individuals have different traits. Some people have darker hair, and some people have lighter hair. Some people have darker eyes. Some people have better sense of smell. Some people can sing. Some people are fast. Some people are strong. That is relatively indisputable. Well, it's actually just completely indisputable, right? Individuals in a population vary. And those traits, those variable traits, observation 2, some of them are genetically based. Now, Darwin didn't actually know from genetics at all. What he said was they're heritable. You get some of those traits from your parents. There's another observation that's not controversial. Observation 3, some inherited traits improve an individual's chance of leaving more offspring. That is, you survive and reproduce better based on some of the traits that you have. It might be that you're strong or fast. if you're a predator. It might be that you're really good at hiding if you're prey species. But those inherited traits improve your chance of leaving more offspring. Now that means your offspring will more likely have those traits, and they will probably mate with individuals that have those traits, and so on and so on and so on. So the likelihood is those traits will become more and more part of the population. They'll be a bigger proportion of the population. So that's the conclusion, and that is 100% of evolution by natural selection. Not really anything there that's controversial. More formally, how Darwin presented it, this is his evolutionary framework from The Origin of Species, which was eventually published in 1859. 1. Variation. Traits vary among individuals. 2. Heritability. Some of this variation is inherited. 3. Adaptation. Some individuals survive and produce more offspring as a consequence of inherited characteristics. 4. Natural selection. The differential survival and reproduction of individuals resulting from genetically based variation in their behavior, morphology, and physiology. That's what comes about. 5. Evolutionary change occurs as the heritable traits of the populations that survive and reproduce are spread through the population, and the traits of less successful individuals are lost. That's it. That's all of evolution. Some things to remember about evolution. Natural selection selects traits, not individuals. We're looking for strength or large horns in the case of these bighorn sheep. They win headbutting contests, and therefore they leave more offspring. So the bigger your horns are, the more likely you are to have offspring. So now all of the male bighorn sheep have very large horns, right? They're not selecting that individual, they're selecting the horns. Also, evolution must occur. As a population grows, there are different traits that will be selected for and not. But traits that have evolved because they allow individuals to survive and reproduce better are called specifically adaptations. And adaptations have to have a genetic basis that excludes all learned behavior. So if you learned where to turn or a particular direction to go into, that's not going to be passed down to your offspring. They will have to learn it as well. However, the capacity to learn may be an adaptation. You might pass on a trait that makes it easier for you to learn specific kinds of information. That definitely can be an adaptation. So what's some evidence of evolution? Some of it is found in structural adaptations, and this can be behavioral or actual physiological. In this case, we have a grasshopper who has clipped a leaf and is carrying it around with them so that predators think that they are a plant and avoid them. That means that they are more likely to survive. There are other species that actually just have body parts that look like leaves for this very reason. Chameleons also blend into their, or camouflage, right? They camouflage themselves by changing their color so they blend in better. That's another example of a structural adaptation. Some evidence of evolution. This is a graph of the resistance to the antibiotic vancomycin. And you can see that the resistance to it was pretty much zero until 1990. And then it exploded. Why? Because of evolution. So we had a bunch of bacteria that were normal. That means that vancomycin would affect them. That's the blue. And then one resistant bacterium in orange. In the second panel, we treat those bacteria with vancomycin, and almost all of the normal bacteria die, but the resistant bacteria does not. In panel 3, the resistant bacteria has become a larger proportion of the population, and in 4, you see an entire infection. Basically, you have the entire population is resistant. That is why it's so hard. We're basically in a war to keep ahead of bacteria with better and better and better antibiotics because we use antibiotics too much. There is a link here to the evolution of bacteria in a web video. I will also put that link up on the website. Other evidence of evolution, of course, fossils and anatomy. You're going to take a look at how we detail anatomical structures in different species to trace evolution in your internet lab. One of the things we look at, though, is homologous structures. Homologous structures include things like the hand for chimpanzees, humans, and gorillas. What you can see is the incredibly close and similar structure of hands for these three species, and that tells us that the likelihood is that the opposable thumb in primates developed once, and it was before the evolutionary split between chimpanzees, humans, and gorillas. Other examples of homologous structures include the double-lobed wings of dragonflies and butterflies, and the four limbs that we find in a wide variety of species, including lizards, birds, humans, whales, as opposed to the analogous structures, not homologous structures of octopus, sea stars, and grasshoppers. The opposite of this is analogous structures, and this is through convergent evolution. The best example of this is the wings of the bat and the bird, and you can see from these structures that while they have the same four limb structures, they have one solid bone on top, they have two bones in the middle that rotate around each other, and then they have the finger bones. The actual structure of the wing itself is completely different. Birds only have structure where the wing bones are on top, and the rest of the wing is created out of feathers. Bats actually have skin stretched across pretty much the entire arm structure, and that's what makes up their wings. This kind of evidence suggests to us that after the four limbs evolved, the bat lineage and the bird lineage split, but they split before the wings evolved. Right? So we actually had two evolutionary events to create those wings, one in the bat and separately one in the birds. They're not alone. These are examples of mouth structures that have evolved separately in the pangolins, the armadillos, and the anteaters, and all four of these species actually evolved completely separately from each other, but they all have the elongated nose and the sticky tongue because they eat ants. Other evidence of evolution is in vestigial structures. For example, these blind fish that still have eyes. And in embryos, what you can see is actually the four limbs here. Because they are evolutionary old structures, you see them very similar in fetuses, even in fetuses like alligators versus mice. They look very similar. Similarly, also, embryos, you can see tailbed embryos of the snake, chicken, and possum, and the early embryos look a lot more like each other than the late forms because of evolutionary traits. I am going to stop there, actually. There's a great video here, but we're going to talk about that in the next time. So that is evolution. We're going to talk more about the controversy of evolution in the next video.